We all make bad choices, do things we don't feel so good about afterward. It doesn't mean we're bad people, just that we made mistakes. Sometimes costly ones. Ones that hurt other people, or even set us down the wrong path ourselves. But whether we label it a mistake, a slip-up, or a transgression, we always end up in the same place, with regret. You know the feeling. It's not a good one. In fact, it can be so painful sometimes that many people want to avoid it altogether. Live by the slogan, no regrets. You know, YOLO. You only live once. Avert your gaze and just move forward. But where does the idea that regret is bad come from? And is it even right?
I think it's a terrible idea. It is not an effective recipe for living a satisfying life.
That's best-selling author Daniel Pink, and he would know. He wrote the book on regret. Literally. His book is actually called The Power of Regret, and in it he says most of our ideas about this emotion are wrong, both in terms of what causes regret and how we should deal with it.
I think it comes from Americans in particular being fed a bill of goods, which is that the path to a life well lived is to always be positive and never be negative, to always look forward and never look back. And it's one of those cases where generally good advice has been taken too far.
On this episode, we'll talk to Dan about what his database of 23,000 regrets has taught him regarding this often misunderstood emotion.
The idea that you should never look backward is foolish, because regret is an emotion that, when we treat it right, is powerful in helping us make progress in the future.
And we'll hear from world-renowned Buddhist teacher Sharon Salzberg about how the practice of mindfulness and self-compassion can help us move through regret and start anew.
Recognizing we can learn, we can begin again, we have the potential.
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works. For better or worse, I tend not to sweat the small stuff in life. But that doesn't mean there aren't things I wish I did differently. And when I think about those, it's hard not to let them suck me down the rabbit hole of regret and self-criticism. If only I'd done it differently. Or, why wasn't I smart enough to see the problem with my choice? The result can feel pretty isolating, like other people probably wouldn't have made those mistakes. But a few years ago, Dan Pink conducted 2 big surveys when writing his book about regret. Surveys where he talked to thousands of people from across the world and found results that made me feel a little less alone.
I said, how often do you look back on your life and wish you had done things differently? So I'm describing regret, but I'm not using that word. It's sort of 5-point scale of all the time to never. And we had 1% say never. And something like only 13 or 14% say rarely. So you had 80-something% saying, at least occasionally I do this. And so that supports the idea of how widespread this is.
And this wasn't just one particular demographic. It held across all ages, genders, ethnicities, education, and income levels. In fact, it turns out that regret is one of the most common negative emotions we humans feel. It's a fact of life, whether we like it or not. But despite how widespread it might be, it's still kind of tricky to pin down.
It's an emotion that makes us feel worse when we look back on decisions or indecisions we've made in the past. And in part, we look back on those, we feel bad about those decisions, in part because we think that the present that we're in right now would be different had we decided in a different way in the past. Even my tortured description of it shows how cognitively complex regret is.
One of those complexities is the ability to time travel.
I sent him into the future.
Not literally, of course, but in our minds.
Catch up with him in the time machine.
We humans don't live solely in the present. Unlike most other animals, we can revisit and replay the past, as well as imagine what's coming in the future.
But what we do is we get in the time machine, we go back to the past, we make different decisions in the past, then we get back into our time machine, go to the present, and the present is now different because of the decisions that we made differently in the past.
But it gets even more complex. Our futures and past are kind of like a multiverse. We can run endless simulations. Think of all the possible things we could have done or should do differently, and all the possible outcomes that could have or might occur as a result.
We have incredible storytelling capacity. And so you combine time travel with storytelling, and it's a superpower in some ways.
A superpower, but like every superpower.
It can be used for good or evil, you know?
Exactly. Exactly. It can be used for good or for ill. And that's where something called counterfactuals come in. Counterfactuals are a way of framing regrets and come in two main types: at leasts and if onlys.
I think the most common one is, oh, I really regret marrying that idiot, but at least I have these two great kids.
At leasts are the downward counterfactual. You have a regret, mistakes were made, but at least there's some upside to it.
So if you do a downward counterfactual, you feel better. There's no question about it. It softens the pain.
Don't dwell on the mistakes. Focus on the positive. Now take the opposite frame for regret. The upward counterfactual of if only.
With upward counterfactuals, if only I had married Fred instead of Steve, you feel worse.
If onlys time travel back to the original regrettable incident and then cause you to run all the possible scenarios of what a life with Fred would have been like. All the roads not traveled, days not seized, you get the picture. That dwelling can feel pretty bad and can get you stuck in an endless loop of what ifs. So let's go back to the downward counterfactual of the at least frame. Well, at least I've got great kids in our divorce example. The positive forward-looking approach is better, right? Right?
So at least make you feel better, but they don't help you necessarily do better. If onlys make you feel worse and can help you do better. And I think the tricky thing is that most of us, we want the do better part. We don't want the feel bad part. So you have this paradox here. Why would something so unpleasant be so useful? There's got to be something adaptive to it. And I think what is adaptive to it is that regret is a signal that we did something that we shouldn't have done or should have done something that we didn't do. And we can use that to move forward.
So what's the answer to whether regret is a bug or a feature of our brain?
It's a feature that if you don't regularly install your software updates can become a bug. So we have two different poles here. We have no regrets. You feel that regret coming on, you plug your ears, you say, no. Look forward, be positive. That's the way to go. On the other hand, the other side of it is that you have many people who wallow in their regrets, who ruminate on their regrets, who stew on their regrets. That's a bad idea too.
The wisdom, I think, of emotional intelligence is knowing which emotion, when, and how much.
Exactly. Well said. I mean, I think that you want to have some diversity. You want to have more positive emotions and negative emotions, but you want to have some negative emotions. If you have all positive emotions, things are going to go south on you. What we should be doing is thinking about our regrets, using them as signals, using them as data, using them as information. And when we do that, we have some pretty good evidence that it can be a transformative emotion. It can help us on a range of professional tasks. It can help us on a range of personal challenges. And I think we haven't been taught how to do that effectively.
We need tools to manage those emotions and to learn from them, especially when it comes to regret. Here, Dan says spiritual traditions have a lot to offer.
I actually think religious traditions do a better job of helping us contend with negative emotions in general and regret in particular than secular traditions do. They provide people rituals. They provide people ways to make sense of these negative emotions. They provide people a path to the future. You see it with moral regrets in Catholicism. You have confession and expiation. You disclose what you've done wrong. An authority figure listens to it and then kind of extinguishes it in the name of God. Like, that's a powerful ritual for a moral regret. It's a ritual that doesn't exist in secular society. If you look at Judaism, Judaism has, an entire day, the most sanctified day of the Jewish calendar that's devoted to atonement for the things that you've done wrong. So I think that those kinds of rituals gives people coping mechanisms in a way that secular society is simply saying, be positive, look forward, not back.
But when I think about those, there's an element that strikes me as important here in how these rituals work. So the way confession works is you go in to this private booth and there's a screen, but the priest can talk to you and you confess your sins to someone, to another human being who in that moment gives you absolution, like co-physically present. In Yom Kippur, I know part of it is that to be forgiven, it's not only about being forgiven by God, it's about making amends with the people here first to make that forgiveness happen. And there are ritualized confessions of sin. And so I'm wondering, because we have this ability, as you've talked about, to run simulations and to time travel and to create, scenario upon scenario, does that physical act of another human with authority saying, this is over, do you think that's an important part in overcoming that regret?
I think it serves a variety of functions. So if you think about simply confession and is a form of just simply disclosure. And I keep coming back to the idea of sense making. So, as an emotions researcher that, I think there's pretty good evidence that, emotions are blobby. They're amorphous sometimes. And so by converting them to words, whether it's written words or spoken words, you're actually making them less amorphous, slightly more concrete, which I think allows you to make sense of them, that they have less of an ominousness in your life. And so disclosure, I think, is an unburdening in part, but I also think that it's a way to take the amorphous and make it a little bit more concrete and therefore allows people to make sense of it.
With disclosure, though, and I think this goes along with exploring how religion helps or hurts, it can lead to kind of guilt and self-flagellation or compassion and forgiveness. So do people tend to be more self-flagellist or to have self-compassion for their regrets?
They're more likely to self-flagellate, in part because they haven't been taught self-compassion. Self-compassion was new to me until a few years ago, not only as a concept, but as a practice. Like, I didn't know you could do that. I think I understood that you could be compassionate toward other people, but I didn't know that was an option to yourself, truly. And so I think it's a weakness of secular society that we haven't taught people self-compassion. I was actually really blown away by some of the self-compassion research because as a secular, formally educated, urban, hard-charging professional, it's like self-compassion seems like weak, soft. But when I look at the evidence, it's pretty powerful.
It was for me too. I came to it from studying the Buddhist tradition. I had the same initial impulse you did, which was, isn't that kind of a way of letting yourself off the hook and making things easy? But both the theology and the practice there and the data that we see from it is actually having self-compassion actually leads to better emotional health, and it empowers you, right? It makes you more effective in some ways.
What you have to do is you have to take a step back and say, okay, what did I learn from this and how am I going to use this in the future?
Regrets are instrumental to the story of our lives. We construct narratives that stitch together and make sense of past events. But those narratives can be ones of condemnation or redemption. It's a choice we make with every decision. To face the regret and criticize ourselves for failing, or ask, what can I learn from this to make me better in the future? Still, facing it can be painful, a pain to which self-compassion, if we have it, can be a salve. Up next, we'll talk to Sharon Salzberg about Buddhism's advice on how we can manage the inevitable pain of facing regret, calm our internal criticism, and change our perspective in order to begin again. If you'd like to see a map of the regrets Dan Pink gathered for his regret survey or contribute your own, you can visit worldregretsurvey.com. How do you think about the concept of regret?
Well, it all depends on how you use the words. So the way I'm accustomed to using the words, there's regret or remorse on the one side. It's a recollection of something we said or did or held back from saying or doing. And there's pain associated with that.
That's Sharon Salzberg, a renowned Buddhist teacher and the author of many best-selling books on Buddhist wisdom. And she's pointing out an idea at the heart of many Buddhist teachings. Pain and suffering, whether a result of regret or something else, is part of life. It's not inherently bad as long as we learn from that pain and have compassion for ourselves and others.
There's a very beautiful statement of the Buddhas where he said, if you truly loved yourself, you'd never harm another. We have a breathtaking potential to be a force of good in this world, and we don't live up to that an awful lot of the time, and that's just the truth of human frailty. But we can look at that experience, whatever it was, we can learn from it. In effect, we can move on from it with a determination to try not to act the same way again.
But the other approach to past mistakes, the opposite of what Sharon sees as the generative potential of regret and remorse, is shame and guilt.
Well, the old Buddhist way, we look at the opposite. Like, what happens when you do get stuck? I'm so awful. I'm so terrible. It's impossible. It's an impossible situation. I will never learn. I can't be any better. And we just go on and on and on and on. So what's the consequence of that? We're exhausted. We're demoralized. We don't have any resilience. So there's no sense of repair when we're very stuck. And also there's often, I think, a tremendous isolation, and it's not onward leading. And one of the keys to self-compassion is kind of recognizing that making big bloopers, and acting recklessly sometimes, this is part of the human condition. It's a sense of, I'm not going to castigate myself. I'm not going to denounce myself. I'm not going to identify as the fool who can't ever learn. But in that space of caring, I'm going to actually open to what might change. And embedded in that is a kind of compassion.
For a lot of people, they'll say, self-compassion, isn't that letting yourself off easy? Isn't it just complacency?
I've heard that so many times. Well, that's just laziness, that's just not having any standards. And of course, I don't believe it has to mean any of that. It's really recognizing we can learn, we can begin again. We have the potential. A harsh, punitive environment, either internal or external, will spike performance, but briefly, and then we crash. The best way to actually sustain an effort, learn something new, break an old, difficult habit, is actually self-compassion.
So I can understand this logically and philosophically. But one of the problems I often have is I have regrets for actions that I've committed. And I understand logically what you're saying about how I should have compassion for myself and I should move forward in a way that makes me better in the future rather than assuming I'm a total failure, everything is wrong, and I'm stuck with it. But what the head thinks and what the heart feels sometimes are very different. So what is it about Buddhist practice, do you think, that helps get the mind in line with the heart, right? That helps me move beyond that heaviness that I feel.
Well, I would start by allowing oneself to feel the heaviness, that's not easy. And we do many things to avoid that. And feeling that should be erased is also sometimes feeling that our actions shouldn't have consequences, which is not going to be the case. There are consequences. That's why we feel bad. But learning how to be with that very unpleasant feeling, that very difficult feeling, again, without either pushing it away and trying to hide it, or the other extreme, getting completely overwhelmed by it.
To move beyond regret in a productive way, we actually have to embrace it first. And Buddhism doesn't only tell us to do that, it gives us a tool that lets us sit non-judgmentally with our failures.
That's what mindfulness actually is the ability to be with whatever our experience is. And that's almost like the launching pad for being able to learn from it. Very common, fundamental way of meditating would be trying to rest your attention on some object of awareness, like the feeling of the breath. And that was the first meditation instruction I ever received when I went to India as a college student. I just thought, that's so stupid. Like, how many breaths will it be before my mind wanders? 800 breaths? 900 breaths? And to my shock, it was like one breath.
Yeah, I have that
and
experience.
I'd be gone,
Yeah.
What's really important is letting go and starting over. It's really a practice of recovery. That's the whole point. That's why it's a training in resilience. But I didn't believe it. I kept thinking, I'm a failure. I'm the worst meditator that ever lived. It was a whole learning to say, okay, essential to the practice of meditation is the ability to begin again.
I never thought of that, but actually the way you're describing it and my own experiences of meditating starting were exactly that. It's, I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
Oh, I failed. And then it's self-castigation
That's
and regret about that failure and then letting myself start again. So in some ways,
That's
the
right.
lesson is right there.
That's right. It's right there. I've seen it so many times. You don't have to kind of accompany that with a lecture about self-compassion or self-forgiveness. It's being trained. It's being strengthened.
And as that muscle is being strengthened, it offers us greater insight into how to confront and deal with those feelings of regret.
We can begin again with having a different relationship to that heaviness or that shadow. It's not sort of a program for eradicating or annihilating certain impressions or habits. But as soon as we start relating differently to them, the whole world changes. If you're looking more for like, I have to, get rid of every imprint of that terrible thing that happened, like today, that's going to be a lot of pressure, but we can change our relationship to what is right now. And it is such a sense of potential. And it's a very strong belief in Buddhism. No matter who we are, no matter what we've done, no matter what's been done to us, we have a potential within to grow, to change, to learn, to love, to connect. And that potential is never, ever destroyed.
The parable of the second arrow offers one of Buddhism's most important lessons about how to deal with suffering skillfully. It's said that the Buddha once asked a student, if a person is struck by an arrow, is it painful? Yes, of course. The Buddha then continued, if the person is struck by a second arrow, is it even more painful? Again, the answer was, yes, of course. To which the Buddha said, in life, we can't always control the first arrow. However, the second arrow is our reaction to the first. This second arrow is optional. I think this describes regret really well. We can't avoid it. None of us is perfect. And so we will make wrong choices. And the pain from those choices is real. But it's what we do next, how we think about those choices that matters. If we beat ourselves up, if we assume that we're irredeemable, we pile on the pain. But the solution isn't to avoid that pain, to ignore it or repress it, because while doing that might make us feel better for a little while, we won't learn from our mistakes. We'll make them again and cause more pain down the line. The true way out is to embrace the pain of the first arrow, the inciting incident, but heal the wound it caused by learning why that arrow struck in the first place. This is the growth that can come from harnessing regret, learning what we can do to minimize more arrow strikes in the future. And that's where a mindfulness practice can help. It's no instant panacea, but it is a step down the path to enlightenment, even if that initial enlightenment only has to do with understanding the role of regret in charting the course of our lives. With that in mind, we asked Sharon if she'd be willing to lead us in a brief meditation on how to begin again. So, if you'd like to give it a try, You might pause here for a minute to find someplace quiet and comfortable. And when you're ready, we can begin.
If you want to just sit comfortably, close your eyes or not, however you feel most at ease, you can just relax. I can start just by listening to sound. It could be the sound of my voice or any sound that may be predominant, allowing your experience to come and go. Bring your attention to the feeling of your body sitting, whatever sensations you discover. And bring your attention to the feeling of your breath, just the normal, natural breath. You don't have to try to make it deeper or different. Wherever you feel it most distinctly, the nostrils, chest, or the abdomen. Find that place, bring your attention there, and just rest. See if you can feel one breath. Without concern for what's already gone by, without leaning forward for even the very next breath, just this one. And if images or sounds or sensations or emotions should arise, but they're not very strong, if you can stay connected to the feeling of the breath, just let them flow on by. You're breathing. It's just one breath. But if they are strong, you get pulled away, or you fall asleep, or spun out in thought, whatever it might be, don't worry about it. You can recognize you've been gone. Notice how you speak to yourself in that moment. See if you can gently let go, shepherd your attention back to the feeling of the breath. If that voice was harsh, see if you can soften it, recognizing you can begin again. No matter how many times you have to let go and begin again, it's totally fine. The poetic way of saying it is the healing is in the return, not in never having wandered to begin with. It's just one breath and coming back to it. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes or lift your gaze, and we'll end meditation.
Next time on How God Works. In modern society, we tend to think of grit and effort as the keys to success.
Our standard strategy when we run into a problem is to just try harder. Just pull an all-nighter or drink some more caffeine.
But if you're trying to fall asleep or you need to shine during a presentation, trying harder may not always be the answer.
There are these situations in life where to reach the goal you want to reach, you need to not try to do it. You need to relax.
So, how are you supposed to not try without trying to? That's next time. How God Works is hosted by me, Dave DeSteno. This episode was written by Josie Holtzman and me. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our associate producer is Emmanuel Desarme. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. To learn more about the show and access episode transcripts, you can find our website at howgodworks, all one word, .org. And for news and peeks at what's coming, feel free to follow us on Instagram at howgodworkspod, or me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.